Continuing Alexander from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. If by good chance there had not been people at hand, with a great many vessels of water for the service of the bath, with all which they had much ado to extinguish the fire, and his body was so burned all over that he was not cured of it for a good while after. Thus it is not without some plausibility that they endeavor to reconcile the fable to truth, who say, this was the drug in the tragedies which Medea anointed the crown and veil with which she gave Creon's daughter. For neither the things themselves nor the fire could kindle of its own accord, but being prepared for it by the naphtha, they imperceptibly attracted and caught a flame which happened to be brought near them. For the rays and emanations of fire at a distance have no other effect upon some bodies than bare light and heat, but in others, where they meet with airy dryness and also sufficient rich moisture, they collect themselves and soon kindle and create a transformation. The manner, however, of the production of the naphtha admits diversity of opinion, or whether this liquid substance that feeds the flame does not rather proceed from a soil that is unctuous and productive of fire, as that of the province of Babylon is. Well, there's this spot up in Russia that has been burning for years, right? Where the ground is so very hot that oftentimes the grains of barley leap up and are thrown out as if the violent inflammation had made the earth throb, and in the extreme heats the inhabitants are wont to sleep upon the skins filled with water. Harpalus, who was left governor of this country, was desirous to adorn the palace, gardens, and walks with Grecian plants, succeeding in raising all but ivy, which the earth would not bear, but constantly killed, for being a plant that loves a cold soil, the temper of this hot and fiery earth was improper for it. But such digressions as these the impatient reader will be more willing to pardon if they are kept within a moderate compass. At the taking of Susa, Alexander found in the palace 40,000 talents and money ready coined, besides an unspeakable quantity of other furniture and treasure, amongst which was 5,000 talents worth of Himerionian purple, that had been laid up there in 190 years, and yet kept its color as fresh and lively as at first. The reason of which they say is that in dyeing the purple they made use of honey, and of white oil in the white tincture, both of which after the like space of the time preserve the clearness and brightness of their luster. Dinon also relates that the Persian kings had water fetched from the Nile and Danube, which they laid up in the treasuries as a sort of testimony to the greatness of their power and universal empire. The entrance into Persia was through a most difficult country, and was guarded by the noblest of the Persians, Darius himself having escaped further. Alexander, however, chanced to find a guide in exact correspondence with what Patia had foretold when he was a child, that Lucus should conduct him into Persia, for by such an one, whose father was a Lucian, and his mother a Persian, who spoke both languages, he was now led into the country, by way of something about, yet without fetching any considerable compass. Here a great many of the prisoners were put to the sword, of which himself gives this account, that he commanded them to be killed, in the belief that it would be for his advantage. Nor was the money found here less, he says, than at Susa, besides other besides other movables and treasures, as much as 10,000 pair of mules and 5,000 camels could well carry away. Amongst other things, he happened to observe a large statue of Xerxes thrown carelessly down to the ground. In the confusion made by the multitude of soldiers pressing into the palace, he stood still and accosting it as if had been alive. "Shall we," he said, "neglectfully pass thee by? Now thou art prostrate on the ground because thou once invadest Greece, or shall we erect thee again in consideration of the greatness of thy mind and thy other virtues?" But at last, after he had paused some time and silently considered with himself, he went on without taking any further notice of it. In this place he took up his winter quarters and stayed 4 months to refresh his soldiers. It is related that the first time he sat on the royal throne of Persia, under the canopy of gold, Demaratus the Corinthian, who was much attached to him and had been one of his father's friends, wept in an old man's manner, and deplored the misfortune of those Greeks whom death had deprived of the satisfaction of seeing Alexander seated on the throne of Darius. From hence designing to march against Darius, before he set out he diverted himself with his officers at an entertainment of drinking and other pastimes, and indulged so far as to let every one's mistress sit by and drink with them. The most celebrated of them was Thais, an Athenian of Ptolemy, who was afterwards king of Egypt. She, partly as a sort of well-turned compliment to Alexander, partly out of sport, as the drinking went on, at last was carried so far as to utter a saying, not becoming of her native country's character, though somewhat too lofty for her own condition. She said it was indeed some recompense for the toil she had undergone in following the camp all over Asia, that she was that day treated in, and could insult over, the stately palace of the Persian monarchs, but she added it would please her much better if, while the king looked on, she might in sport with her own hands set fire to the court of that Xerxes who reduced the city of Athens to ashes, that it might be recorded to posterity that the women who followed Alexander had taken a severer revenge on the Persians for the sufferings and affronts of Greece than all the famed commanders had been able to do by sea or land. What she said was received with such universal liking and murmurings of applause, and so seconded by the encouragement and eagerness of the company, that the king himself, persuaded to be of the party, started from his seat, and with a chaplet of flowers on his head and a lighted torch in his hand, led them the way, while they went after him in a riotous manner, dancing and making loud cries about the place, which, when the rest of the Macedonians perceived, they also in great delight ran thither with torches, for they hoped the burning and destruction of the royal palace was an argument that he looked homeward, and had no design to reside among the barbarians. They just didn't understand their language. Thus, some writers give their account of this action, while others say it was done deliberately. However, all agree that he soon repented of it and gave order to put out the fire. Well, the master didn't, but there were people who could act as translators. Alexander was naturally most munificent, and grew more so as his fortune increased, accompanying what he gave with that courtesy and freedom which, to speak truth, is necessary to make a benefit really obliging. I will give a few instances of this kind. Ariston, the captain of the Paonians, having killed an enemy, brought his head to show him, and told him that in this country such a present was recompensed with a cup of gold. "With an empty one," said Alexander, smiling, "but I drink to you in this, which I give you full of wine." Another time, as one of the common soldiers was driving a mule laden with some of the king's treasure, the beast grew tired, and the soldier took it upon his own back, and began to march with it, till Alexander, seeing the man so overcharged, asked what the matter was, when he was informed just as he was ready to lay down his burden for weariness. "Do not faint now," he said to him, "but finish the journey and carry what you have there to your own tent for yourself. he was always more displeased with those who would not accept of what he gave than with those who begged of him. And therefore he wrote to Phocion that he would not own him for his friend any longer if he refused his presents. Well, if it's not unlawful legally or morally, why not? Accept the presents. You don't have to, pick up necessarily luxury that you're handed out. But of course, if you have allergies, people should, hey, don't. I'm allergic to that. Don't send that to me. He had never given anything to Serapion, one of the youths that played at ball with him, because he did not ask of him, till one day, it coming to Serapion's turn to play, he still threw the ball to others, and when the king asked him why he did not direct it to him, because you do not ask for it, said he, which answer pleased him so that he was very liberal to him afterwards. One Proteas, I don't know how that is. It Proteus? Which where are we looking? Oh, I guess lowercase, so it's like that. But no, I don't know the spelling. So one Proteus, a pleasant, jesting, drinking fellow, having incurred his displeasure, got his friends to intercede for him, and begged his pardon, himself with tears, which at last prevailed, and Alexander declared was friends with him. I cannot believe it, said Proteus, unless you first give me some pledge of it. The king understood his meaning, and presently ordered 5 talents to be given him. How magnificent he was in enriching his friends and those who attended on this person appears by a letter which Olympias wrote to him, where she tells him he should reward and honor those about him in a more moderate way. For now, said she, you make them all equal to kings. You give them power and opportunity of making many friends of their own, and in the meantime you leave yourself destitute. People would criticize Muhammad the same way, that he would distribute his share of the booty and stuff, the war spoils. To the point of not having any coins left behind, right? She often wrote to him to this purpose, and he never communicated her letters to anybody unless it were one which he opened when Hephaestion was by, whom he permitted, as his custom was, to read it along with him. But then, as soon as he had done, he took off his ring and set the seal upon Hephaestion's lips. Mazaeus, who was the most considerable man in Darius's court, had a son who was already governor of a province. Alexander bestowed another upon him that was better. He, however, modestly refused, and told him, instead of one Darius, he went the way to make many Alexanders. To Parmenio he gave Bagoas's house, in which he found a wardrobe of apparel worth more than 1,000 talents. He wrote to Antipater, commanding him to keep a lifeguard about him for the security of his person against conspiracies. To his mother he sent many presents, but would never suffer her to meddle with matters of state or war, not indulging her busy temper. And when she fell out with him on this account, he bore her ill humor very patiently. Nay, more, when he read a long letter from Antipater, full of accusations against her, Antipater, he said, does not know that one tear of a mother effaces 1,000 such letters as these. But when he perceived his favorites grew so luxurious and extravagant in their way of living and expenses that Hagnon the Tyan wore silver nails in his shoes, that Leonatus employed several camels only to bring him powder out of Egypt to use when he wrestled, that Philotas had hunting nets 100 furlongs in length, the more used precious ointment than plain oil when they went to bathe, and that they carried about servants everywhere with them to rub them and wait upon them in their chambers. He reproved them in gentle and reasonable terms, telling them he wondered that they, who had been engaged in so many single battles, did not know by experience that those who labor sleep more sweetly and soundly than those who were labored for, and could fail to see by comparing the Persians' manner of living with their own that it was the most abject and slavish condition to be voluptuous, but the most noble and royal to undergo pain and labor. He argued with them further how it was possible for any one who pretended to be a soldier either to look well after his horse or to keep his armor bright and in good order, who thought it much to let his hands be serviceable to what was nearest to him, his own body. Are you still to learn, said he, that the end and perfection of our victories is to avoid the vices and infirmities of those whom we subside, and to strengthen his precepts by example. He applied himself more vigorously than ever to hunting and warlike expeditions, embracing all opportunities of hardship and danger, insomuch that a Lacedaemonian, who was there on an embassy to him, and chanced to be by when he encountered with and mustered a huge lion, told him he had fought gallantly with the beast, which of the two should be king. Craterus caused a representation to be made of this adventure, consisting of the lion and the dogs, of the king engaged with the lion, and himself coming in to his assistance, all expressed in figures of brass, some of which were by Lysippus, and the rest by Eucharis, and had it dedicated in the temple of Apollo at Delphi. Alexander exposed his person to danger in this manner, with the object of inuring himself and inciting others to the performance of brave and virtuous actions. But his followers, who were grown rich and consequently proud, well, you don't have to be proud or a sense of not worthy or something just because you're rich or poor or famous or not famous or whatever, longed to indulge themselves in pleasure and idleness, and were weary of marches and expectations, and at last went on so far as to censure and speak ill of him, all which at first he bore very patiently, saying, it became a king well to do good to others, and be evil spoken of. Meantime, on the smallest occasions that called for a show of kindness to his friends, there was every indication on his part of tenderness and respect. Hearing Peucestus was bitten by a bear, he wrote to him that he took it unkindly. He should send others notice of it, and not make him acquainted with it. But now, said he, since it is so, let me know how you do, and whether any of your companions forsook you when you were in danger, that I may punish them. He sent Hephaestion, who was absent about some business, word how, while they were fighting for their diversion with the ichneumon, Craterus was by chance run through both thighs with Perdiccas's javelin, and upon Peucestus's recovery from a fit of sickness, he sent a letter of thanks with his physician Axippus. When Craterus was ill, he saw a vision in his sleep, after which he offered sacrifices for his health, and bade him do so likewise. He wrote also to Pausanias, the physician, who was about to purge Craterus with hellebore, partly out of an anxious concern for him, and partly to give him a caution how he used that medicine. He was so tender of his friend's reputation that he imprisoned Ephialtes and Chisus, who brought him the first news of Harpalus' flight and withdrawal from his service, as if they had falsely accused him, when he sent the old and infirm soldiers home. Eurylacus, citizen of Aga, got his name enrolled among the sick, though he ailed nothing, which being discovered, he confessed he was in love with a young woman named Telesippa, and wanted to go along with her to the seaside. Alexander inquired to whom the woman belonged, and being told she was a free courtesan, he said, I will assist you. He said to Eurylacus, in your amour, if your mistress be to be gained either by presents or persuasions, but we must use no other means, because she is freeborn. It is surprising to consider upon what slight occasions he would write letters to serve his friends. As when he wrote one in which he gave order to search for a youth that belonged to Seleucus, who was run away into Cilicia, and in another thanked and commended Bucestus for apprehending Nikon, a servant of Craterus, and in one to Megabuzus concerning a slave that had taken sanctuary in a temple, gave direction that he should not meddle with him while he was there, but if he could entice him out by fair means, then he gave him leave to seize him. It is reported of him that when he first sat in judgment upon capital causes, he would lay his hand upon one of his ears while the accuser spoke, to keep it free and unprejudiced in behalf of the party accused. But afterwards such a multitude of accusations were brought before him, and so many proved true, that he lost his tenderness of heart, and gave credit to those also that were false, and especially when anybody spoke ill of him, he would be transported out of his reason to show himself cruel and execrable, valuing his glory and reputation beyond his life or kingdom. No. Die rather than submit, right? Submit to something disreputable for yourself, right? Or something against your principles. But to what extent do you hold that, right? He now, as we said, set forth to seek Darius, expecting he should put to the hazard of another battle, but heard he was taken and secured by Bessus, upon which news he sent home the Thessalians, and gave them a largesse of 2,000 talents, over and above the pay that was due to them. This long and painful pursuit of Darius, for in 11 days he marched 3,300 furlongs, harassed his soldiers, so that most of them were ready to give it up, chiefly for want of water. While they were in this distress, it happened that some Macedonians, who had fetched water and skins upon their mules from a river they had found out, came about noon to the place where Alexander was, and seeing him almost choked with thirst, presently filled an helmet and offered it to him. He asked them to whom they were carrying the water. They told him their children, adding that if his life was but saved, it was no matter for them. They should be able to well enough repair that loss, though they all perished. Then he took the helmet into his hands, and looking round about, when he saw all those who were near him stretching their hands out and looking earnestly after the drink, he returned again with thanks without tasting a drop of it. For, said he, if I alone drink, the rest will be out of heart. The soldiers no sooner took notice of his temperance and magnanimity upon this occasion, but they one and all cried out to him to lead them forward boldly, and began whipping on their horses, for whilst they had such a king, they said they defied both weariness and thirst, and looked upon themselves to be little less than immortal. But though they were all equally cheerful and willing, yet not above 80 horse were able, it is said, to keep up and fall in with Alexander upon the enemy's camp, where they rode over abundance of gold and silver that lay scattered about, and passing by a great many chariots full of women that wandered here and there for want of drivers, they endeavored to overtake the first of those that fled, in hopes to meet with Darius among them. And at last, after much trouble, they found him lying in a chariot, wounded all over with darts, just at the point of death. However, he desired that they would give him some drink, and when he had drunk a little cold water, he told Palestratus, who gave it him, that it had become the last extremity of his ill fortune to receive benefits, and not be able to return them. But Alexander, said he, whose kindness to my mother, my wife, and my children, I hope the gods will recompense. Now it's the word daemon, daemon in the Greek, will doubtless thank you for your humanity to me. Tell him, therefore, in token of my acknowledgement, I give him this right hand, instead of theon or deity or something. And then, with which words he took hold of Polystratus' hand and died. When Alexander came up to them, he showed manifest tokens of sorrow, and taking his own cloak, threw it upon the body to cover it. And some time afterwards, when Bessus was taken, he ordered him to be torn in pieces in this manner. They fastened him to a couple of trees which were bound down so as to meet, and then, being let loose with such great force, returned to their places, each of them carrying that part of the body along with it that was tied to it. Darius's body was laid in state and sent to his mother with pomp suitable to his quality. His brother Exathres Alexander received into the number of his intimate friends, and now with the flower of his army he marched into Hyrcania, where he saw a large bay of an open sea, apparently not much less than the Euxine, with water, however sweeter than that of other seas, but could learn nothing of certainty concerning it further than that in all probability it seemed to him to be an arm issuing from the lake of Maatis. However, the naturalists were better informed of the truth, and had given an account of it many years before Alexander's expedition, that of 4 gulfs, which out of the main sea enter into the continent, this known indifferently as the Caspian, and as the Hyrcanian Sea. Okay, just looking for the identification of that. Is the most northern. Here the barbarians, unexpectedly meeting with those who led Bacythales, took them prisoners, and carried the horse away with them, at which Alexander was so much vexed that he sent a herald to let them know he would put them all to the sword, men, women, and children, without mercy, if they did not restore him. But on their doing so, and at the same time surrendering their cities into his hands, he not only treated them kindly, but also paid a ransom for his horse to those who took him. From hence he marched into Parthia, where, not having much to do, he first put on the barbaric dress, perhaps with the view of making the work of civilizing them the easier. I wish they didn't just say barbaric just because they didn't understand their, just because they were a different culture or something. As nothing gangs more upon men than a conformity to their fashions and customs, or it may have been as a first trial, whether the Macedonians might be brought to adore as the Persians did their kings, by accustoming them by little and little to bear with the alteration of his rule and course of life in other things. However, he followed not the Median fashion, which was altogether foreign and uncouth, and adopted neither the trousers nor the sleeved vest nor the tiara for the head, but taking a middle way between the Persian mode and the Macedonian, so contrived his habit that it was not so flaunting as the one, and yet more pompous and magnificent than the other. At first he wore this habit only when he conversed with the barbarian or within doors among his intimate friends and companions, but afterwards he appeared in it abroad when he rode out and at public audiences, a sight which the Macedonians beheld with grief. Yeah, because a bunch of sociopaths. Well, I mean, it's natural for armies to be a little bit more fascist. But they so respected his other virtues and good qualities they felt it reasonable in some things to gratify his fancies and his passions of glory, in pursuit of which he hazarded himself so far, that besides his other adventures, he had but lately been wounded in the leg by an arrow, which so shattered the shank bone that splinters were taken out, and on another occasion he received a violent blow with a stone upon the nape of the neck, which dimmed his sight for a good while afterwards, and yet all this could not hinder him from exposing himself freely to any dangers, insomuch that he passed the river Oryxartes, which he took to be the Tanais, and putting the Scythians to flight, followed them above 100 furlongs, though suffering all the time from diarrhea. The Scythians are the people of the steppes of Eurasia, the Slavic people, and the Turks, and the Mongolians, and the Tibetans, and the Tibetans kind of settled down after their initial period of converting to Buddhism, though. Although a lot of trained fighters and amongst them compared to other peoples. Here many affirm that the Amazon came to give him a visit. So Clitarchus, Polycletus, Anasicritus, Antigonus, and Easter tell us that. But Aristobulus and Carus, who held the office of reporter of request, Ptolemy and Anticletus, Philon the Theban, Philip of Theangela, Hecataeus, and Evretrian, Philip the Chalcidian, and Duris the Samian say it is wholly a fiction, and truly Alexander himself seems to confirm the later statement, for in a letter in which he gives Antipater an account of all that happened, he tells him the king of Scythia offered him his daughter in marriage, but makes no mention at all of the Amazon. And many of the years after, which Anisicritus read the story in his fourth book to Lysimachus, who then resigned, the king laughed quietly and asked, "Where could I have been at that time?" Well, a lot of exaggeration, but maybe there was a female, branch of the German army, or who were the Amazons? But it signifies little to Alexander whether this be credited or no. Certain it is that, apprehending the Macedonians would be weary of pursuing the war, he left the greater part of them in their quarters, and having with him in Hyrcania the choice of his men only, amounting to 20,000 foot and 3,000 horse, he spoke to them to this effect, that hitherto the barbarians had seen them no otherwise than as it were in a dream, and if they should think of returning when they had only alarmed Asia and not conquered it, their enemies would sit upon them as upon so many women. Well, even if they are your enemies, this free woman or not, there's certain, don't take women without their permission. Well,